We had some very interesting questions during the break that I'd like to share with you because some of the rest of you may have those same questions. One question was, if a table cannot compare, can a table show a comparison? And the answer is yes. That's a very good trick that we frequently do. We want to avoid the anthropomorphism problem, right? So we don't say the study analyzed. We can say the study presents an analysis. It's a little bit redundant, but at least we can avoid that problem of connecting the human verb to the non-human inanimate object. So yes, that's a good solution. Another thing, another question that we had was, can we change the tense in the sentence? And the answer is yes, we can. We gave you the example of the literature review. We said, for example, Jones found, past tense, that X affects, present tense, Y. We can do that. The first verb, found, refers to the fact that Jones is finished now, right? His finding is over now. But the second verb, or we say complement verb, affects, says that his finding is still a fact today. So the first and second verb have different functions. First verb refers to when it happened. Second one to whether it's a fact or not. Now, if I don't know it's a fact, I could say affected, right? It happened once, I don't know if it always happens. Or if it was an implication, I could say may affect. I could use the tentative present tense for my second verb there. So yes, we do often change our verb in the same sentence. Another question I had is about quotations. When we are doing qualitative research, for example, and we are speaking to someone in an interview, right? I'm interviewing you. What kind of tense do we use when we are talking about what the person said? And the answer is, we would do the same thing. We would say, Mrs. Smith said, colon, space, quote, and then we would quote her. If she used the present tense, we would keep the same present tense, right? Just because she said it in the past, we would not change what she said. We would just put quotation marks around it, and we would cite her, quote her exactly as she spoke to us. But the verb of report would be past tense because her speaking is over. But her sentence, whatever tense she used, we would use that same tense within our quotation marks when we're talking. All right, now I want to get back into some more fun tools that you can use while you're writing your paper. Tense was a big one. I know, I hit that one first. I hope you're not too tired. I hope you had some coffee. This second part of our time together, I'm going to give you several little ones together. We said before that as scholars, as researchers, we never stop learning. As professionals, it is our responsibility to continue to upgrade our skills, right? It's our responsibility to continue to use our tools better. And I'm going to give you some great tools here coming up that will help make your paper understandable. It's also important to remember that when our paper is rejected for poor English, it's usually not just one or two big things. It's usually many little things. Many little mistakes equal one big problem, rejection. So we are concerned about these little things because reviewers often assume if we don't care about the little English things, we might also not care about our research. If we are careless here, they wonder, where else is he careless? They begin to doubt the quality of everything. So our English becomes a measurement of quality for our research. Is this fair? No, but it happens. So we need to be oh so careful about those details, and we need to understand that those little errors are all important, and the more we can avoid them, the stronger our building will be. Remember our metaphor of building the house. You can make a few mistakes here and there, and your building will still stand strong. But when you make a lot of mistakes and the typhoon comes, we have a serious problem. So we are going to look at these errors. First, how to use colons and semicolons. Lot of misunderstanding about this. I want to show you in academic writing how a semicolon and colon can be very useful or how it can be badly misused as an error. Second, how can we use commas? I'm going to give you 3 different situations when commas are your best friend, when commas will communicate and help you communicate very clearly to your reader. How to use dashes. Dashes is that long, mysterious line in your paper. How and why do we use it? I will be talking about why or where you should use it and where you should definitely not use it. How to use a hyphen. Hyphen is the short, mysterious line in your paper. When do we use a hyphen, and what is the function of the hyphen, and how does the hyphen affect the meaning of the term that we are communicating? How can we use nouns as adjectives? Students are often confused when we put one word in front of another to modify it. Do we need to hyphenate it? When do we need to hyphenate it? How is it changed? When do we need to add an AL to make it an adjective? I'm going to explain that too. How to use as, because, and since. These 3 words are terribly abused. These poor words are often used incorrectly, so much so that the American Medical Association and the APA have a special section only for these words because it's such a problem. I'm going to tell you how and when you should use each of them in your writing. How to start a sentence with because. I know your elementary school teacher told you you could not start a sentence with because. She was wrong. We can. And I will show you how, and I'll show you why using because is actually better than most alternatives to that word that you might use. Finally, how to use initialisms and acronyms in your writing. Most technical papers do have some kind of abbreviations in them, and often we use them wrongly. And the key to using them right is distinguishing between the 2 kinds of abbreviations. One is called an initialism, and one is called an acronym. They are not the same, and we will treat them differently grammatically. And I'm going to give you examples of that too in our time together. Punctuation is the hammer and nails. I know I keep going with this crazy tool metaphor, but I thought of it last night, and I thought it was a good idea. So I found an ugly picture online and stuck it in my PowerPoint. They look like nails, though, don't they? See those little nails right there? These hold our paper together, hold our meaning together. Let's talk about how to use colons and semicolons. First, what does a colon do? What's the function of the colon? Colon are the 2 dots, right over each other. The colon introduces a list or a clause that precedes it. Let me give you a sentence with a colon. Let's start by looking at the only rule of colon use, colon. A colon should only appear after a complete sentence. This sentence is true. We must use a colon only after a complete sentence. And in this case, I am connecting these 2 independent thoughts together tightly, closely, by using a colon. Now, I could also use a comma. Let's start by looking at the only rule of comma use, comma, which is that notice it's longer, isn't it? And I have to use which is a pronoun, and we hate pronouns for many, many reasons. If we can avoid pronouns and go with a good colon that keeps that sentence tight and close together, we like it. It's strong writing. Let me give you an incorrect sentence using the colon. And you can see a common mistake. This study will examine, colon, interest rates, financial structure, management issues, and systematic processes. My student, I asked him, why did you use a colon? And he said, because I have a list that comes after it. And yes, we do use a colon before a list. A list follows the colon, fine. But what comes before the colon? Is it a complete sentence? No. Remember, our only rule for using colons, only rule actually, is that we must have a complete sentence before we use our colon. So I could rewrite it like this. This study will examine 4 major factors, colon. Are we happy there? Yes, that's fine. And then I have my list. Interest rates, financial structure. Notice what comes after the colon doesn't have to be a complete sentence. We don't care. We can have 1 word, 10 words, doesn't matter. But what comes before the colon must be a complete, grammatically correct sentence. Let me give you one more example of incorrect colon use. This study will examine, colon, interest rates as set by the central bank, the financial structure of the XYZ company, management issues involving employees. No, 4 major factors, colon, right? Must be a complete sentence before. Let me move on to the semicolon, which is a little bit more complicated than the colon. The colon we frequently use before a list, but we're sure it's always a complete sentence. That's our rule. Semicolon functions differently. 2 main uses. Number 1, it can be in the place of a comma in a list. In such cases, the semicolon is more like a comma, except it allows us to include complex elements. Sometimes we have a long list, but there are commas inside of our list. You know what I mean? How do we separate items in the list that already have commas? By another comma? No, it's confusing. Semicolons are the key here. They're like a strong comma to separate long items in a list. I'm going to give you an example in our next slide. Second function of the semicolon is in place of a period when we want to connect 2 sentences together and we don't want to stop the thought. You know, sometimes, most of the time, when you read a sentence and you see a period, you stop thinking about the connection of the items in that sentence. But when we see a semicolon, we know that what follows is closely related to what we just said. Period separates it too much. We want to keep it close. Semicolon can help us do that. I'm going to give you examples of both of these. Let me start with the list. Here it is. The sentence. The research on scholars' academic writing for international publication confronts 3 main issues, colon. Is this correct? Yes, that's fine. It's a complete sentence and it's before a list. It's a good use of the colon. We continue. The difficulty of finding suitable samples of academic writing at a similar English level across domains, semicolon. Why do I use a semicolon? Because my item on the list is so long that if I use a colon, as a regular comma, it's too weak to hold this huge list together. I continue. The tension between co-authors, comma, given that their knowledge of English may differ widely. Now notice that I'm using a comma in one of my items. So this is why I choose semicolon to separate those items. I don't want to use a comma for 2 functions in one sentence. It becomes confusing. So I change to the semicolon for these long lists or for a list that has an internal comma already inside the items on the list. And the tendency of researchers to value harmonious working conditions over correcting each other's English errors and the possible conflict that it might create. Because of this internal comma, I've decided to use semicolons to separate the items in this longer list. Here is the same sentence again with commas. You see, instead of using the semicolon, I use the commas. But the problem is here. English level across domains, the tension between co-authors, given that their knowledge of English may differ widely. It's confusing to me. I don't know if this is another item or if this is the same item, you see, because I've recycled my comma too much. So whenever you have a comma in your lists, use the semicolon to separate those larger items in your list, and your reader will thank you for it. Let me give an example of the second case of when we can use a semicolon. When we are trying to connect 2 independent ideas together, and we don't want 2 sentences. Because we know when we separate into 2 sentences, our reader will stop on sentence 1 and think it's over before he begins sentence 2. We don't want him to stop thinking, so semicolon can gently connect it together. Example. Rejection by journal editors for poor English can only be avoided by revising the document carefully first to ensure that English errors have been removed, semicolon. This process of revising requires that the author and proofreader understand. Now, of course, I could put a period here, but I don't want to because the process is the same process that I just talked about in my previous sentence, and I hope my reader knows that. So rather than start a new sentence, I use the semicolon to elegantly connect them together, letting them know that, yes, this is a break in the thought, but the thought is not over. Continue on, please. Semicolon can do that for you. And semicolon is a very underused grammar tool. It's a wonderful little friend that you should use. It's a little nail that can exactly do what you want it to do in long lists and when you have a long sentence like that, and yet it's not used enough. Either students put nothing in, and I have to just keep reading and reading and reading, not knowing when it will ever end, or it ends unpredictably in the middle. But the semicolon, that beautiful little thing, can do exactly what you want when you have a long thought, like this author does here in this sentence. Here's the same sentence again. However, in this case, I just put one long, crazy sentence without a semicolon, and it's much harder for me to read and understand. Especially here. To ensure that English errors have been removed, comma, which means that this process, which means that this. It's ugly to put in there. We don't like pronouns, and which by itself is often difficult to know which one is which. We would prefer to avoid it if we can. Semicolon, of course, will avoid that problem because we can put it in right after the removed here. So, semicolons can divide grammatically while uniting thematically. All right, that's what it does. It puts a little pause in the middle of our sentence, at the same time keeping that theme, that idea together in that same sentence. We're going to talk about this later, but we often use a semicolon with two types of words: conjunctive adjectives and transitional expressions. I know that these conjunctive adverb is like a word like however. Frequently before the word however, we will use a semicolon. Frequently before the word nevertheless, we will put a semicolon. Frequently before the word specifically, we will put a semicolon. Frequently before the word equally important, for example, on the contrary. This is a very good place to think about a semicolon. If you put a period, it kind of looks like a new thought, but usually it's not a new thought. Usually it's connected to the previous thought, and the semicolon will do that trick for you very well. We're going to also discuss later, you cannot put a comma before however. That's grammatically incorrect. Semicolon, you can. The only one you can put before, we're going to talk about what you can put before a comma when I talk about commas later. But just remember for now that semicolon is very frequently used before words like however. Here's an example of semicolon use. 95% of students recognize the importance of clear writing, semicolon, however. Isn't that nice? I don't have to start a new sentence. I don't put a comma because that's grammatically incorrect. You can only put a comma before a conjunction, like and, but, for. But semicolon before however is very good. We frequently do that. Let's talk about how to use commas for a few minutes. We can use commas in three ways. We can use commas and coordinating conjunctions. We can use commas in pairs, which means two together. Or we can use commas before relative clauses. I will tell you what is a relative clause in a moment. But these are the major functions of the comma. And they all have a different meaning and different function in these three different situations. Let's talk about the commas and the coordinating conjunctions first. Coordinating conjunction. What is a conjunction? Conjunction joins two independent clauses in your sentence. We only have 7. There are total 7 conjunctions. They are and, but, so, or, nor, for, yet. Only 7 of them. I made it into an acronym, fanboys, so my students can remember. Fanboys are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Okay? It's got to be one of the fanboys. Now, the coordinating conjunction, the fanboys are very powerful because only these words can connect two independent clauses with only a comma. Just these. Only these. And later we're going to show this is one big error students make. They use a comma plus however. They use a common plus nevertheless. But those are not the fanboys. Only the fanboys can use the comma to connect the two independent ideas together. Now, I have ranked these in their order of use. And is the most common, and then but, and then so, and then or. But fanboys, not in the right order, but easier to remember for students. So only these 7 words can give us the compound sentence with a comma pattern, none other. If we just remember that, we can avoid many comma errors that we make in our writing. Here's an example of commas with coordinating conjunctions. Some researchers believe in first sending their papers to low-impact journals, but others, comma, but others, it's one of the fanboys, right? So we can have the comma and then the conjunction directly. Except for those 7, no other word can have that function. Comma, but others maintain that first sending their papers to a high-impact journal for review is more effective for publishing their research. Now, the comma but lets me know as a reader that these are 2 independent ideas that I'm putting together here in my sentence to make a new one. Let's take a look at a common comma error we call the comma splice error. And this happens when I put 2 independent clauses together with a comma but no conjunction. Example, reading is part of discovery, comma, experience indicates that reading the literature efficiently is essential. Wrong. I must have a coordinating conjunction here because I have 2 independent ideas, 2 full sentences that I'm putting together. Can't put them together with only the comma. Must have one of the fanboys to help. Doesn't really matter which one. Well, it matters which one. They have different meanings, but must have at least one of them to be grammatically correct. For example, reading is part of discovery, comma, and our favorite fanboy, and experience indicates that reading the literature efficiently is essential. What if we do it with and no coordinating conjunction? Is that right? It's not. Reading is part of discovery and experience indicates. No, can't do that. Must have the comma when I have 2 independent ideas here, 2 independent clauses. We must have comma and one of the fanboys. Comma and one of the fanboys, or semicolon, or something there. Let me give you an example, and I know I have a lot on one slide. Don't be scared away. It's okay. We'll go slowly. But I wanted to put it all on here to show you one sentence and how we correct it. Here's the error. Don't use commas to separate independent sentences not joined by conjunctions. Here's my first sentence, which is correct. X is used in signaling reactions that is essential for homeostasis, comma, but Y initiates a response. This is correct, right? One independent thought connected to another independent thought with a comma and a fanboy. We're happy. Look at the next one. X is used in signaling reactions that is essential for homeostasis, comma, however. Is that right? No. I have got to have one of my fanboys there. Or I could put a semicolon, however. We talked about that before, right? That's fine. Semicolon before a transitional word. Or semicolon before a conjunctive, before equally important. For example, any of these with the semicolon would be fine. Or fanboy with the comma. Now, students often confuse but and however. They think but and however is the same thing. They have a similar meaning, it's true, but their function is different because however is what we call conjunctive adverb. It's different. And but is a coordinating conjunction. But always works with the comma. Conjunctive, however, would work with the semicolon. Here's another example, an error. Here's the original sentence. The design process starts with an agenda, comma, consequently, following conventional design methods, will lead to a structure that is only suited to achieving the primary mission. Do we like this sentence? We don't, because it's two independent ideas, right? Two independent clauses. I want to connect them together, but remember the rule. If you're using a comma, it must be one of the fanboys. Consequently, is that one of the fanboys? It's not. We have no C in fanboys, right? Consequently is like however. It's that kind of word that can only go with the semicolon. So, to correct this, number one, and probably the best choice, this is my favorite. Correction number one, we use the semicolon. The design process starts with an agenda, semicolon, consequently. This would save us most of the time. This is probably our first choice. However, we could modify it in other ways too. The design process starts with an agenda, comma, fanboy, and. That can also work. I don't like this one though, because and doesn't have the same meaning as consequently, does it? I changed the meaning, so it's not a good correction. Or the design process starts with an agenda, period, consequently, new sentence. Also okay, but I don't like it because it separates the idea very much. And whenever I say the word consequently, clearly I'm connecting to the previous idea that I just said. So to maintain that closeness, I would prefer to use the semicolon. That would be a really good choice here for this situation. Let's talk about using pairs of commas. First, we use a comma before a coordinating conjunction, the fanboys, right? That's the comma's first function. Second, we use commas together to show that information is supplementary. Supplementary means information is not grammatically essential for the sentence. If we cut out the information between our commas, our sentence would still make sense, right? Usually the material between commas will further describe something that I've just said in my sentence before. Let me give you an example of this. This novel approach, comma, proposed by Zhang, comma, has provided an alternative to conventional methods. Let me give you two other examples of this sentence. This novel approach, comma, proposed by Zhang, has provided an alternative. This novel approach proposed by John, comma, has provided an alternative. These two are wrong. Neither of them gives me any useful information about the information in that sentence and its connection to the rest of the sentence. I should either have no commas or two commas. Either one would be fine. One comma by itself is doing me nothing here. It's giving me no additional information. It's not describing anything. So we would prefer to say, this novel approach proposed by Zhang has provided an alternative to conventional methods, or number one. Number one or number four. Number two and three is useless for us. The comma's not doing anything, not describing anything. Now, if you notice in my first sentence, proposed by Zhang, this is describing the approach. If I took this out, this novel approach has provided an alternative, the sentence would still be fine, right? So here we are using commas to show that grammatically non-essential part of our sentence. We can do this in other ways too, and I'm going to show you in a minute how. We could also use parentheses. We could also use dashes on both sides. If we use a dash on both sides, we are saying this is very important. If we use a comma on both sides, we're saying this is pretty important. If we use parentheses, we're saying this is not important. And that's why we use parentheses for page numbers and references and that kind of thing, because it's so low priority. But they all perform the same function, showing the grammatically non-essential descriptive part of our sentence. Here is another example. According to Zhang, comma, this novel approach is vital. This novel approach is vital according to Zhang. This novel approach, according to Zhang, is vital. Now, these sentences are actually okay because according to Zhang is a clause that I'm connecting to the beginning or to the end of my sentence. They're all right. But you notice that the first one is actually, it sounds the best one. It sounds best. Because I want to make sure that the important information is usually at the end of the sentence. Here, this novel approach is vital. It seems awkward to put it right there in the beginning. The third one also works, where I give the descriptive information about the novel approach. They're all okay, actually, but the first one is actually best because of the positioning of the information, the key point at the end of our sentence. Let me give you another sentence. Researchers, whose papers are frequently rejected, comma, start to believe that editors and reviewers personally dislike them. I get this from students a lot. The reviewers hate me. Maybe they do, probably not. Of course, we must be careful not to give reviewers a reason to hate us, and when I read the letters back to the reviewer, sometimes I think maybe the reviewer does hate us because students will argue so aggressively with the reviewer. That's a different topic. But the sentence here. This is an example of the third use of the comma, where I use it to separate a relative clause. Relative clause begins with a word like which, that, who, whom, and whose. When we have a clause beginning with one of those words, it's called a relative clause because it is related to something else in the sentence that we just talked about. In this sentence, whose is related to the researchers, right? Now, here's the problem with my student's sentence. He says researchers whose papers are frequently rejected. When he puts the comma before whose, it makes it look like all the researchers' papers are frequently rejected. You see that? When we put the comma there, it's describing the whole group that we just said. Researchers, all of them, their papers are frequently rejected. My student actually didn't want to say that. What did he want to say? He wants to say researchers, some of them, in which case we should not use the comma here, right? Because we want to restrict to just some of them, not all of them. Be careful of that comma coming before which and whose, because that comma indicates it's all of the people, all of the group that you just mentioned before in your word. Let me give you another example. Given the economic conditions in Thailand, which is located in Southeast Asia, government programs for stimulating local business is essential. Now, this is fine here. This clause, this relative clause, is describing Thailand, and it's describing all of Thailand, isn't it? All of Thailand is located in Southeast Asia. That's fine. I'm not trying to say some of Thailand is. It's all of it. So a clause or a comma beginning here and ending here is correct use of the comma in this case. Students often have a lot of trouble between which and that. So let me talk about which and that with you for a few minutes, and whether or not we should use commas with which and that. Let me show you two sentences, one with which and one with that. The first one, the samples that showed a change in DH2 between precursor and product were analyzed. Or the samples, comma, which showed a change in DH2 between precursor and product were analyzed. They're both correct, but they both mean very different things. In the first sentence, I use that. And what am I saying? I'm saying some samples showed a change and some didn't. And the samples that showed a change were analyzed. In the second one, because I have the comma and which, I'm saying all the samples showed a change. When you use the word that, it is talking about some of them. When you use which, it's talking about all of them. Let me give you another example here. I'm going to give you three. The books, comma, which stem from the 1960s and the early 1980s, show Smith emphasizing the use of grammar in classroom instruction. I'm saying all the books, aren't I? The books, all of them, which stem from this period, show Smith. My second sentence, the books that stem from the 1960s and the 1980s show Smith emphasizing. Here we have some of them, right? It's not all, it's some. Here's the tricky one, the last one. The books which stem from the 1960s and early 1980s. Am I talking about some of them or all of them? It's very tricky here. It should be some of them, but there's no comma. So students sometimes scratch their head and think, so which is it? This is exactly the problem. Many people think, what are you talking about? So here's our rule. If you use which, always use a comma. If you use that, never use a comma, and then you'll never have this problem. I know that some English teachers will argue with me and say, technically, this is correct. Technically, it is. But our first job in technical writing is to be clear. And because many people, even native English speakers, scratch our heads about this, I suggest to just keep it really, really simple, okay? If it's integral, use that. Always say that without commas. Always say which with commas, okay? This is a good rule to keep in mind when you are writing, okay? If you're using which, use a comma. If you're using that, don't use a comma. That means some of them, which means all of them, and keep your life simple. Rather than thinking about 4 things, just think about 2. So, use that to introduce defining or restricted clauses. That means some of them. Don't use commas. And use which to introduce non-defining or non-restrictive clauses, and use your commas. That way you have a lot less to worry about. Let's review what we know about commas. First, use comma before your coordinating conjunction when you're connecting 2 independent thoughts, right? Comma and the fanboys. Any of the fanboys are fine. Don't use just the comma alone, and don't use just the fanboy alone. It's got to go together to connect those 2 independent thoughts. If you're using a word like however, don't use the comma either. Use a semicolon to connect that. When you put commas together in pairs, the information between the commas should be grammatically non-essential. That means if you took it out, the sentence would still make sense. And we have 3 ways to do that. We can do it with commas, which is pretty important, parentheses, not really important, or dashes, extremely important. I'm going to talk about dashes a little bit later. Final use for the comma is that we can use comma with a relative clause. What are the relative clause? A clause beginning with whose, which, that. And it will describe something that came before. That, as we said, is a restrictive clause and never takes a comma. Which is non-restrictive, all of them, and always takes a comma. You remember that simple rule, you're going to avoid a lot of your common grammar errors. I learned a long time ago that if people sit for over 50 minutes without a break, they sleep like babies. And I see I'm approaching 40 minutes. Let's take a quick break, shall we? 5 minutes. Come back cheerful and happy, and we're going to finish up our last section together.